Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vittorian, and this is the 25th hour, helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Now, in this week's episode for the week of October 31st to November 6th, Eric Adams is the newly elected mayor of New York City. De Blasio filed paperwork to run for governor. Biden announced new climate change pledges at the COP26 conference. Congress passed Biden's physical infrastructure proposal, which is half of his agenda. And the Supreme Court heard arguments about Texas's abortion law and New York's gun law. Now, onto the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this, starting with de Blasio. After the vaccine mandate went into effect in New York City, sending any public employee without at least one shot home without pay, de Blasio sought to downplay the number of city workers that were told to go home. Police Commissioner Dermot Shea said 89 cops were told to go home, up from 34 at the start of the week, saying that amounts to 0.25% of the department. 6,000 officers filed for special accommodations. Meanwhile, the mayor also called any union leaders that didn't get their own shots as unpatriotic and promised consequences for FDNY staff who participated in a sick-out and didn't come into work. 2,300 firefighters called out sick, leaving 18 fire companies out of service, but no fire stations were shut down, contrary to some reports. Despite all of the noise surrounding fire companies and EMTs slowing down service, the statistics bore out a different story, with response times from fire trucks and ambulances staying the same before and after the vaccination mandates were put in place, and 2,000 FDNY performed the sick-out. In the meantime, 6,000 police officers filed religious and medical exemptions, as we mentioned just now, with Commissioner Dermot Shea saying it'll take time to get through all of the requests. De Blasio ultimately struck a deal with 9 labor unions working with the city about how unvaccinated employees will be handled, with the unions agreeing to drop their legal disputes against the city. The agreement puts rules on workers who applied for religious and medical exemptions, with requests limited to workers who are part of an organized religion, with a letter from a clergy member as proof, but workers also got more time to apply for those exemptions and have the right to work for pay while they wait for official decisions on those requests. The mayor said that as soon as vaccines for kids under 12 were authorized, the city would be ready to distribute those shots within 24 hours. De Blasio later said that kids could get vaccinated at clinics starting Thursday. One way the city plans on incentivizing the kids of Gotham to get their shots, $100 if they go to their schools or city-run clinics. The city rolled out new guidance for vaccinating the age group and have also launched a website for parents looking for answers to their questions about the shots. This past week saw Election Day here in New York City, where offices from mayor to council members are up for grabs. As was expected, Democratic Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams was elected mayor Tuesday night shortly after the polls closed, becoming Gotham's second black mayor on a platform of public safety. There were barely any polls done in the race, but the one Emerson College poll showed Adams with double-digit leads in front of Guardian Angels founder Curtis Sliwa. Sliwa conceded to Adams shortly after the polls closed. Adams started speaking out about his specific policy positions, as he's expected to concretely list what his administration plans to do on various policy fronts. The mayor-elect, for instance, said that he supports de Blasio's decision to lift the ban on solitary confinement at Rikers in order to tackle the disorder crisis at the Island Jail. And when it comes to the city's vaccine mandates against public workers, Adams said he would revisit the decision, saying he wants to reach a resolution with the city's labor unions. Adams also said that his first 3 paychecks are going to be in Bitcoin, and a sign that he says will be the start of New York City becoming the cryptocurrency capital of the world, competing with Miami, whose mayor also wants their pay in Bitcoin. Adams also said that no exceptions will be made to the city's vaccine mandate, specifically for Brooklyn Nets basketball player Kyrie Irving, who continues to refuse to get vaccinated. When it comes to the losses Democrats incurred throughout other races, Adams said that he wasn't surprised, since the party was catering to so-called anarchists. Underscoring the moderate tone of the new city mayor, Adams said that another big goal of his would be to pressure state legislators to amend bail reform to give judges more deference to detain arrestees in lieu of bail, which was notably part of the issue needing bail reform in the first place. In other closely watched races, former Deputy Attorney General Alvin Bragg beat his Republican opponent Thomas Kenneth to succeed current DA Cyrus Vance Jr. and become Manhattan's first black DA. Bragg inherits a series of investigations looking into former President Trump's companies and accomplices. Bragg announced a diverse transition team on his way into the new job in January. In Staten Island, former Republican Congressman Vito Fossella declared victory in the borough president's race, thanking our great president Donald Trump. In general, the turnout did not bode well when it came to hopes that off-year elections will get more voters out to vote, with less than a quarter of city voters submitting their ballots. With Adams' election comes the question of who he'll choose to be the next school's chancellor, with signs pointing to Eagle Academy Foundation president David Banks. Although Adams can choose to keep Misha Ross Porter, sources say Banks is a shoo-in, considering the family ties between the two, with Banks' partner Sheena Wright co-chairing Adams' transition team and Banks' brother advising Adams on public safety. As for who would be Adams' new police commissioner, which Adams promised would be a female, the reported shortlist includes former Seattle Chief Carmen Best, Philadelphia's Danielle Outlaw, yes, that's her name, and former Newark, New Jersey Chief Yvonne Roman. De Blasio signed an executive order lifting a ban on solitary confinement at Rikers in an attempt to combat the rampant situation there, including a lack of corrections officers and a jump in prisoner injuries and deaths. The order also suspended other corrections rules, preventing locking prisoners in their cells for a prolonged time, stopping prisoners from seeing their lawyers, and more. While Cy Vance still has time as the current Manhattan DA, he convened a new grand jury in the case against the Trump Organization to weigh potential charges of tax evasion and other financial fraud. The Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg had already been implicated, where he was recently let go after spending decades at Trump's side. The former head of the Sergeants Benevolent Association, Ed Mullins, officially retired yesterday after he was found guilty by internal police officials of various departmental charges, including leaking a police report involving de Blasio's daughter and using vulgar language and calling the former city health commissioner Osiris Barbett a bitch and Congressman Richie Torres a first-class whore. Mullins is also still facing a federal corruption investigation following an FBI raid on his Long Island home and the SBA headquarters. New York City taxi workers struck a deal with the largest owner of taxi medallions to get some debt relief tied to investments in their medallions, which give them the right to drive yellow taxis throughout the city, as well as ending a 2-week hunger strike by taxi drivers. The Marblegate Asset Management and New York Taxi Workers Alliance agreed to restructure loans to never go beyond $170,000, as well as ending the risk of losing homes on default, with the city acting as a guarantor on those loans. New York officials and power players shuffled to Puerto Rico for the annual Somos Conference, which seeks to introduce major policy leaders and expand the network that can positively influence legislative initiatives. One event in particular getting attention at Somos is an effort to tackle so-called vulture hedge funds, which according to Gothamists are groups that buy cheap government debt and then sue those governments for full repayment. Leaders will also discuss how to close the education gap exacerbated by remote schooling from the pandemic. If you wondered how de Blasio and Governor Hochul paid for their travel to the conference, taxpayers footed the bill. Over at the City Council, although the City Council's races went off largely without a hitch, Republicans made inroads in traditionally moderate bastions. In District 46, encompassing Sheepshead Bay and Brighton Beach, Republican lawyer Ina Vernikov defeated former Republican-turned-Democrat and special education teacher Steve Saperstein, adding a fourth Republican to the ranks of the council. Democrat Ari Kagan narrowly defeated QAnon supporter Mark Shushkowitz to replace term-limited Coney Island and Bensonhurst Councilman Mark Traeger, and Bay Ridge Councilman Justin Brannon is still in a fight for his life against Brian Fox. Democrats failed to steal the Queen's seat of term-limited Republican Eric Ulrich, with the Republican Joanne Ariola defeating newcomer Felicia Singh, and Staten Island Councilman Joe Borelli handily won his seat again with over 80% support. In general, the council is adding a record number of women to its roster, and in fact will be the majority of the council, with 31 women leading the 51-seat unicameral legislature. And while Democrats dust themselves off after the elections, attention is now being paid to the City Council Speaker race, which is selected in secret amongst the council members. Justin Brannon, who still hasn't found out if he's keeping his seat at the time of this recording, might have his hopes dashed for the position. Other council members in the running are Adrian Adams, Diana Ayala, Francisco Moya, Keith Powers, and Carlina Rivera. Over at the Hochul administration, here are the state election results. 3 out of the 5 propositions that were on the ballot ended up failing, with the reason having more to do with those not answering the questions on their ballots rather than organized Republican opposition. Out of the 5 propositions, the questions having to do with redistricting, same-day voter registration, and no-excuse absentee voting failed. The other 2 questions having to do with expanding the jurisdiction of the city's civil court and creating a right to clean air and water throughout the state have passed. And Rochester City Councilman Malik Evans soundly won the office of mayor, calling on the inhabitants of the city to come together to solve a host of issues from crime to education. The former Rochester mayor, Lovely Warren, stepped down after trying to cover up the results of the Daniel Prude investigation, and then the police having found weapons and drugs in her home with her ex-husband and child. In Buffalo, it looks like incumbent Mayor Byron Brown's write-in campaign actually did the trick against Socialist Democratic nominee India Walton, with Walton acknowledging that Brown most likely beat her. Walton scored an upset primary victory against Brown, and then Brown later lost a legal battle to get his name on the ballot, leading him to launch a campaign for voters to actually write in his name. It's not immediately clear whether Brown was the write-in candidate with the most votes against Walton. On Long Island, Republican Ann Donnelly defeated Democratic State Senator Todd Kaminsky for Nassau County DA, and Democratic incumbent Timothy Sini was defeated by Republican federal prosecutor Ray Tierney for Suffolk County DA. Meanwhile, Congressman Tom Suozzi said that he's nearing his decision on whether he'll run for governor. Although it's not clear what his pathway to victory would be, he said as much in a virtual conference with reporters. With Attorney General Letitia James gearing up for her run for governor, the question remains as to who would replace James. State Senator Shelley Mayer was one of the first people to officially throw their hat into the ring, calling the job one of her life's dreams, and where she previously served as Assistant Attorney General from 82 to 94. Other candidates could be Zephyr Teachout, Queens DA Melinda Katz, Brooklyn DA Eric Gonzalez, and State Senator Michael Gianaris. Meanwhile, New York City Mayor de Blasio filed official paperwork intending to run for governor, but sources say there isn't a clear timeline for when de Blasio would announce the run. As part of the governor's new transparency platform, her administration said that State Inspector General investigation results will be posted online from now on. Speaking of transparency, the commissioners of the Joint Commission on Public Ethics met this week to discuss revoking prior approval of Cuomo's COVID book deal, which netted him $5 million. Hochul revealed her plans for Penn Station and a redevelopment of Midtown Manhattan, opting to continue Cuomo's vision but with some slight differences. For Penn Station, Hochul is delaying demolition of buildings south of Penn Station, choosing more pedestrian space instead. And for the Midtown project, Hochul will keep the development of 10 new towers but will make them 7% smaller. The state's new Office of Cannabis Management officially issued new regulations that set standards for the hemp market, placing manufacturing, lab packing, and labeling rules on the industry. Governor Hochul signed a bill into law this week that would ban the sale and display of hate symbols like Confederate flags and swastikas, specifically on police, fire department, and school properties. The governor also expanded who would be eligible under paid family leave law in the state, letting workers take time off to also take care of their siblings, not just kids and spouses, and called for Congress to take up the expansion nationwide as well. Moving on to the state legislature. Brooklyn's Assemblyman Ed Nick Perry is heading to Jamaica, and no, it's not for vacation. President Biden officially nominated Perry to become the next U.S. ambassador to Jamaica, heading back to his birthplace. Another Assemblyman enjoyed being nominated for position, with Governor Hochul choosing Manhattan Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez to become the state's next Secretary of State. What'll happen to the current Secretary of State, Rosanna Rosado? She's going to go on to become the next Commissioner of the Division of Criminal Justice Services. Moving on to the judiciary, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated the 3rd Department Appellate Division's ruling against the Roman Catholic Diocese of Albany, which only allowed religious institutions with employees of the same faith to allow religious exemptions to the vaccine, ordering a rehearing, taking into account the Supreme Court's recent decision in Fulton v. Philadelphia, where the court ruled in favor of a Catholic adoption agency's right to discriminate against same-sex parents looking to adopt. Prosecutors from the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, ahead of a sentencing hearing against MTA employee Thomas Caputo, known as the Overtime Gang, and others, wrote in court filings that Caputo and other MTA workers used their connections to get jobs at huge construction projects like Hudson Yards and the Queens East Side Access Project so that they can sleep and play hooky on the job. Caputo and his colleagues face up to 16 months in jail. The judicial inquiry looking into New York City's response to the death of Eric Garner ended this week, being spearheaded by recently victorious Manhattan District Attorney-elect Alvin Bragg, representing Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, but without much substantive headway, according to the plaintiffs. Carr said there were additional lies uncovered by the city officials Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Erica Edwards allowed to be deposed, but didn't get the chance to hear from the mayor himself. Disgraced former Governor Andrew Cuomo might be wiping some sweat off his brow. In an Albany criminal court filing, prosecutors from the district attorney's office confirmed that their office needs more time to arraign Cuomo due to a potentially defective criminal complaint and exculpatory evidence that was sent to Cuomo's lawyer. Cuomo's appearance has now been delayed by 2 months. By way of reminder, part of Cuomo's slew of scandals was his alleged sexual harassment of about 12 women. Cuomo has maintained his innocence, saying that there is zero evidence to support criminal charges against him. State Supreme Court Justice Deborah James granted an injunction against the city, removing the Trump Organization from being in charge of the Ferry Point Park golf course in the Bronx. After the January 6th insurrection, de Blasio announced a series of contract cancellations with the Trump Organization, including this one. While the Trump Organization argues its case against getting their contract canceled, the city's efforts to find a replacement will stop. U.S. District Judge Frederick Block upheld New York's school mask mandate but criticized the state's jumble of regulations. The mandate was challenged by a parent of a 10-year-old girl with severe asthma, saying the mandate violated the girl's constitutional rights. Court of Appeals Chief Judge Janet DeFiore gave indications this week that the state court system would increase its capacity restrictions as court dockets throughout the state continue to get bloated. Moving on to the Biden administration, the CDC has recommended the Pfizer vaccine for kids aged 5 to 11, with some places in the U.S. able to start administering shots on Wednesday. Moderna's shots for kids are also on the way. The CDC also recommended that those who relied on natural immunity after getting sick with COVID get their vaccines and not rely on just natural immunity, as those who got better after getting the virus and then got vaccinated were more than 2.5 times more immune than those who just got their shots and were never sick with the virus in the first place. Pfizer also announced that new pill Paxlovid prevents 90% of hospitalizations and deaths caused by COVID, according to a placebo study, placing another potential pill in the healthcare market to manage the virus. The UK just approved the first anti-COVID pill that was brought by Merck. The U.S. government has officially canceled its contract with Emergent, a vaccine manufacturer that ruined millions of doses earlier in the year, delaying much-needed Johnson & Johnson vaccines at the time. Emergent is going to forgo $180 million in payments from the $600 million deal. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said she tested positive for COVID this week, working remotely and assuring the press that she hasn't infected the president. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, finally released guidance giving companies with more than 100 employees until January 4th to vaccinate their workforce, with the option of weekly testing instead. The much-anticipated guidance set off a wave of Republican opposition, with 23 red states along with 3 Democrat-led southern states suing the Biden administration to stop the new guidance. What's sure to also get them riled up were news stories reporting that the Labor Department is also considering vaccine mandates on employers with less than 100 employees in order to push back against COVID. Early Saturday, however, a 3-judge panel of the conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals stayed the proposed rule after Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's request, citing potentially grave constitutional and statutory issues. The government has until next week to respond to the stay. One plan down, one to go, as we detail more in a bit. The House passed the physical part of Biden's Build Back Better agenda, approving the Senate passed legislation and sending it to Biden's desk. The president gave a speech Saturday morning touting the physical infrastructure plan's passage. Meanwhile, after moderate West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin signaled that he was ready to support the human infrastructure deal he's negotiating with the president, he made clear that he wasn't going to be rushed into it. Nevertheless, it looks like a deal is getting closer every week as Democrats eye votes in Congress by the end of the month. One person sick of Manchin's opposition to paid parental leave is House Speaker Pelosi, who said that the House version of the bill will have the policy. Manchin said he was surprised at Pelosi's move and said that the policy doesn't belong in the spending bill. On the other hand, the White House and congressional Democrats came to an agreement that would keep initiatives allowing the government to negotiate lower prescription drug prices as being part of the human infrastructure proposal. Pelosi later couldn't take it anymore and scheduled a vote for both infrastructure proposals for this past Friday despite hang-ups in the Senate, but later ended up delaying the vote anyway because moderate Democrats demanded that the Congressional Budget Office score the human infrastructure proposal, which would show how much the law would add to the deficit over time and how much revenue it would raise. The Federal Reserve has officially shown its plan on how it wants to slow down its bond purchases. One way the Fed tries to steer the economy in the midst of rising inflation and supply chain bottlenecks due to the pandemic. By June, the Fed will end its economic stimulus program. Hiring in the country actually had a big boost in October. Employers added 531,000 jobs, the most since July, according to the Labor Department, exceeding projections looking for a 450,000 job increase. August and September job estimates were also revised upwards, with the unemployment rate falling to 4.6% from 4.8%. But with the good news came the news of the U.S. trade deficit hitting a new record in September, widening to $80.9 billion due to the high demand for goods as the supply chain remains bottlenecked. Imports did rise, however, by 0.6% to $288.5 billion. Something gone under the radar a bit is the lifting of certain tariffs between the U.S. and EU instituted during Trump's time, raising the cost of goods on American consumers. However, complicating the deal are current regulations on steel tariffs, since quotas on certain types of steel making it difficult for importers to navigate an environment where a current supply crunch has raised prices and delayed economic growth. Addressing recent news stories circulating around conservative media, Biden said that payments to migrant families that were separated from each other at the border are not going to happen. Conservative media seized on possible settlements between the Justice Department and the families separated at the border to the tune of $450,000 a person. Sources say that the final payouts will be different based on the specific circumstances. The president said he's not going to comment on pending litigation, but answered a reporter that migrants will be incentivized to come to the border if, quote, you guys keep sending that garbage out, referring to the news stories. White House staff later walked back Biden's comments, saying that the president is comfortable with paying out settlements to settle disputes between separated migrant families and the federal government that separated them. One of the biggest obstacles to cleaning up the environment is the actual cost of removing carbon out of the air and what is usually called carbon capture. Now the Energy Department is set to release regulations aiming to cut those costs, with Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm announcing the department would invest money in research for carbon capture with the goal of it costing less than $100 per carbon ton by 2030. Google announced that it's going to pursue a contract with the Pentagon to provide AI technology, which had originally caused a portion of Google's workforce to walk out on the job. The contract this time around is to win the right to work on the joint warfighting cloud capability, with the mission to modernize the Pentagon's cloud technology. In what is called one of the federal government's largest cybersecurity mandates, the Department of Homeland Security sent out a directive to patch hundreds of cyber vulnerabilities throughout the federal government, according to the Wall Street Journal. Telecom companies AT&T and Verizon announced that they were delaying a rollout of their new 5G technology due to concerns raised by the FAA, namely that the technology would interfere with cockpit safety systems. The rollout was for December 5th initially and is now pushed to a month later. The Justice Department announced that it was suing Texas over the election law recently signed by Governor Greg Abbott, which was the scene of Texas Democrats absconding to D.C. for a few weeks before ultimately relenting. The law forbids mail-in ballots and allows for ballot observers to have more access during vote counting, with the Justice Department claiming the policies violated the 1964 Voting Rights Act for instituting unnecessary policies inhibiting the right to vote, as well as discriminating against disabled voters. The DOJ has also brought suit against Georgia and Arizona's election laws. A former analyst that contributed research to the infamous Steele dossier that found Trump that found that Trump was compromised by the Russian government ahead of the 2016 election, but also made claims that prostitutes performed golden showers on Trump, was arrested as part of the John Durham investigation looking into how the FBI handled a counter-investigation into the Trump campaign. During the 2016 presidential election, the FBI looked into whether members of the Trump campaign were compromised by Russian intelligence, which they were, but Trump made unfounded claims of government spying against his campaign. Durham was appointed special counsel by Trump's former Attorney General William Barr, and he was vowed to be left alone by Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland, and has made his third arrest in detaining analyst Igor Danchenko for lying to the FBI about his sources. The Steele dossier was funded initially by conservative news outlet the Washington Free Beacon through the investigatory firm Fusion GPS, but after Trump became the Republican nominee, the law firm Perkins Coie, working with the Clinton campaign, continued funding the investigation behind the dossier. This week saw the COP26 climate conference with the world's biggest polluters, excluding Russia and China, where Biden gave a speech underlying the severity and urgency with which countries need to move in order to avert climate catastrophe in the future. Biden also announced pledges from the U.S. to limit deforestation and limit methane emissions from about 1 million gas rigs across the country. Despite a series of pledges from major countries to curb greenhouse emissions by the middle of the century, climate activists, including teen activist Greta Thunberg, led a protest outside of the conference saying leaders are still just making empty promises and aren't making real moves against climate change. The Pentagon officially came out to declare itself non-negligent when a drone struck a family of 3 adults and 7 kids in August, when it originally thought the car that was hit belonged to an ISIS member with explosives in his truck. Air Force Lieutenant General Sami Saeed said the drone strike was an honest mistake and that no one person was responsible. The families of those who died are getting a payout by the U.S. government. CIA Director William Burns paid a visit to Moscow this week, meeting with one of Putin's top advisors to discuss efforts to curb cyber espionage. Biden had warned Putin that he couldn't tolerate any more efforts of interference by Russia's hackers, whether they're sanctioned by the government or not. Don't worry, the State Department hasn't forgotten about the so-called Havana syndrome, named after mysterious illness originating at the U.S. consulate in Cuba, resulting in headaches and nausea. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has appointed Career Foreign Service Officer Jonathan Ward to coordinate the State Department's overall response, and Margaret Uehara as the Senior Care Coordinator overseeing treatment given to diplomats afflicted by the illness, which has now spread to other foreign missions. The State Department has also approved a $650 million arms sale to Saudi Arabia, notifying Congress of the matter, including 280 missiles for air defense, and wouldn't be able to be used on ground targets. Biden had earlier criticized his predecessor for approving arms sales to Saudi Arabia as well. Over in Congress and starting in the House, as we mentioned before, the House passed Biden's physical infrastructure proposal on a bipartisan 228 to 206 vote, giving him a major legislative victory. 13 Republicans voted in favor, while 6 progressive Democrats voted against the measure, wanting it to be voted on in tandem with the human infrastructure proposal. The $1.2 trillion proposal includes money to improve roads, bridges, pipes, ports, broadband internet connection, water infrastructure, and more, with half the money in the bill amounting to all new spending. Here's the breakdown. The bill splits funds between transportation and utilities, $284 billion for the former and $240 billion for the latter. The biggest funds are $110 billion for roads and bridges, $66 billion for railroads, $65 billion for power infrastructure, $65 billion for broadband internet, with more funding for water infrastructure, public transport, and climate resilient. In the January 6 investigation, former President Trump officially made requests to block the exchange of documents that showcase what Trump's White House did for over 3 hours while his supporters ransacked the Capitol. Apart from Trump not holding the reins to using executive privilege as an excuse anymore, another reason undercutting Trump's arguments is his campaign's payment to Rudy Giuliani's law firm for efforts to overturn the presidential election through the courts, removing Trump's actions as an official presidential act and as one more from a private actor. U.S. District Court Judge Tanya S. Chutkan, hearing Trump's case to block documents from the National Archive, isn't inclined to let Trump have his way, doubting the documents are covered by executive privilege or that the documents had nothing to do with the day of the riot. Jeffrey Clark, the Justice Department lawyer that tried to convince former President Trump of the legality of his false election fraud claims, testified before the January 6th committee on Friday, or at least testified in name only, as Clark refused to answer questions in front of the panel. Clark reportedly invoked legal privilege repeatedly, with Democratic chair of the committee Benny Thompson threatening congressional action against Clark. Thompson also said that the January 6th committee would send out 20 fresh new subpoenas looking for testimony and documents, but didn't specify for who or what. House Congresswoman and chair of the House Oversight Committee Carolyn Maloney made good on her pledge to subpoena 4 oil company executives, saying that leaders of Shell, BP, Exxon, Chevron, as well as the American Petroleum Institute and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce failed to provide requested information for the committee. Maloney was looking for information related to the company's roles in climate science and funding to third parties. Over in the Senate, for the third time, Senate Republicans filibustered in an attempt to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill onto the floor of the chamber. The bill seeks to replace sections of the original 1965 Voting Rights Act that were taken out by the Supreme Court in the 2013 Shelby County decision, which dealt with federal approval of election policies in historically slaveholding southern states, among other policies. Republicans say that the bill is just another federal power grab of local elections. Former Chicago Mayor and Obama Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel's nomination to become the next ambassador to Japan advanced to the Senate floor, although two Democrats on the Foreign Relations Committee, Jeff Merkley and Ed Markey, voted no. Robert Santos was confirmed by the Senate this week to become the Census Bureau's first Latino director. Moving on to the federal courts, the Supreme Court heard arguments this week revolving around New York's gun licensing law, which needs something beyond a general desire to protect the home in order to own a gun. A majority of the court's conservatives seemed inclined to strike down New York's law, which could create ripple effects throughout how the states regulate who gets to carry a gun outside the home, more than a decade after the court first recognized a generalized Second Amendment right to hold handguns at home with certain restrictions. The Texas abortion law was also on the Supreme Court's docket this week, but not the substance of the law, which bans most abortions at 6 weeks regardless of rape or incest. The court heard arguments for and against the enforcement mechanism of the bill, which would empower private citizens to sue anyone that aids or abets an abortion when it doesn't give abortion providers a chance to sue the government itself. A majority of the justices were skeptical about the constitutionality of the enforcement mechanism, but abortion activists aren't holding their breath, as it was the same court that let the Texas law go into effect in the first place. The court also announced that it will take up a case about whether a Customs and Border agent violated a bed and breakfast owner's First and Fourth Amendment rights when the agent shoved the owner in retaliation for reporting an incident where the owner got in between an agent and the suspect he was pursuing. The crux of the case centers around when private citizens can personally sue officers, similar to qualified immunity, shielding police officers from personal lawsuits. The court also took up an appeal from two Alabama doctors who were convicted of running a so-called pill mill and taking money for overprescribing opioids, contributing to overdoses. Doctors Ruan and Khan are saying that the juries in their case should have been told by the trial court that prosecutors had to prove their state of mind went beyond the bounds of normal professional practice in order to be convicted. The circuits are divided on the issue of the so-called good faith defense. The Kyle Rittenhouse case continues, with federal prosecutors saying this week that Rittenhouse instigated the attack and ended up killing 2 people and injured a third immediately after riots in Wisconsin began since the shooting of Jacob Blake. Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old at the time, traveled to Wisconsin from another state with a semi-automatic rifle to, quote, protect private property, saying that he shot and killed 2 people in self-defense. Judge Bruce Schroeder has become a source of attention as well for first denying the prosecutor's request to call the deceased victims, but allowing the defense to cast those shot at Rittenhouse as riots or arsonists if it turns out that that's what they did, and then later stopping the trial to rant against media criticism of his handling of the proceedings. Afterwards, one of the jurors was also dismissed for cracking a racist joke to court officers while being escorted to his car. Biden might get his chance to nominate a 6th judge to the Manhattan Second Circuit Court of Appeals with Judge Susan Carney's ascension to so-called senior status, which opens up a seat in the influential circuit. And finally, in national news, the official number of Americans that have died from COVID has reached 750,000, with reports pointing out the number exceeds the populations of Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming. Officials are worried that infections may rise with the winter coming, but notably the number of cases has dropped by more than half between mid-September and mid-October. Globally, the number of people who died from COVID hit 5 million. The Biden administration said that the U.S. has reached 70% full vaccination and 80% with at least 1 dose. After it was once thought that Green Bay Packers football quarterback Aaron Rodgers was vaccinated, he tested positive for COVID, but not through breakthrough infection, but because he never actually got vaccinated in the first place. Rodgers then gave an interview where he said he was being canceled and took ivermectin, the controversial horse dewormer drug that conservatives are pushing to treat the virus. Election day this year also brought about a lot of results that political observers were watching. In New Jersey, the race for governor came down to the wire, with incumbent Democratic Phil Murphy eking out a victory at the 11th hour against Republican challenger Judge Jack Ciattarelli. Murphy became the first Democrat to win a second term in New Jersey in the position since 1977. In an upset to Democrats, Republican Glenn Youngkin defeated former Governor Democrat Terry McAuliffe, and a sign that Democrats have a lot of work to do in order to keep up their power nationwide. While McAuliffe tried painting Youngkin as just another Trump supporter, a gaffe from McAuliffe that parents shouldn't be in charge of their kids' curriculum snowballed into a larger strategy by Youngkin to not even mention Trump, but to seize on the lie that critical race theory is being taught in public schools. Democrats in the Virginia House had also conceded control to the GOP. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, an anticipated vote to restructure the police department failed. A year after protests against police brutality stemming from George Floyd's murder, voters in Minneapolis City shut down down the effort to scrap the police department as Minneapolis knew it in favor of a new Department of Public Safety, stressing alternatives to aggressive police responses. Other election results ended in Boston gaining its first female and Asian mayor in Michelle Wu, and Republican Winsome Sears becoming Virginia's first black female lieutenant governor. In the midst of scandals painting Facebook as putting profits over safety and rebranding itself as Meta, the social media giant also announced that it's going to shut down its facial recognition system this month, deleting the data of 1 billion users. The program was originally meant to identify people based on their photos, but launched privacy concerns. There was a memorial this week for former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State under George W. Bush, Colin Powell, who succumbed to COVID-related complications while being treated for blood cancer despite his vaccination status. Biden, Obama, and Bush, among others, gathered together for Powell's funeral on Friday. Powell, despite his best efforts, will be best remembered for presenting false intelligence in front of the UN, alleging that Iraq's late former dictator Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, thus justifying a U.S. invasion into Iraq. 8 people died at the Astroworld Music Festival this weekend when rapper Travis Scott was performing. Authorities are still investigating, but preliminary information seems to point out a moment when the concert crowd started rushing towards the front of the stage. The show was called off shortly after. The youngest victim was 14. 3 Florida professors sued the state just before the Florida State University system lifted a ban on the professors not to testify in relation to a voting rights law being challenged by voting rights groups. After initially saying that the professors work for a state university and thus the state of Florida, and banned the professors from saying anything counter to the state's interest, the professors protested that their freedom of speech were being inhibited by the state, leading to eventually the ban being lifted, but they didn't stop the professors from filing suit. And finally, opening statements have begun in the trial against the 3 white men that killed black jogger Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia last February. Hopes are glim at the outset of the trial, with a jury composed of 11 white people and just 1 black person. And that's it for this week's show, The 25th Hour, helping you stay on top of the 24/7 news cycle. Don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, share us with your friends, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com and become a patron today for as low as $2 a month to support the show at patreon.com/the25thhournews. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.